This will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people.
UK Independence Party leader Nigel Farage, a key figure in the movement to leave the EU after this week's dramatic vote. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Fox News senior political analyst Brit Hume, Julie Pace, who covers the White House and the campaign for the Associated Press, syndicated columnist George Will, and USA Today columnist Kirsten Powers. Well, before we get to Britain leaving the EU, George, I want to talk about you. You announced this week that you have left the Republican Party. Why?
I left it for the same reason I joined it in 1964 when I voted for Barry Goldwater. I joined it because I was a conservative. I leave for the same reason that I'm a conservative. Give you a timeline. Shortly after Trump became the presumptive nominee, he had a summit meeting with Paul Ryan where they stressed their common principles and their vast shared ground, which is much more important than their differences. I thought that was puzzling, doubly so because Paul Ryan still didn't endorse him. After Trump went after the Mexican judge from northern Indiana, then Paul Ryan endorsed him. And I decided that, in fact, this is not my party anymore. I changed my registration to unaffiliated 23 days ago. I hardly made an announcement. I just mentioned this in a meeting with the Federalist Society. So the long and the short of it is, as Ronald Reagan said when he changed his registration, I did not leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me.
Now, not surprisingly, Donald Trump has tweeted his reaction to this news today. Let's put it up on the screen. He says that you are overrated and that you lost your way a long time ago. Would you like to respond, Mr. Trump?
He has an advantage on me because he can say everything he knows about any subject in 140 characters, and I can't.
All right. On to Brexit. Julie, President Obama famously sided with Britain staying in the EU, saying that if they left, they would go to the back of the queue when it came to trade deals. How worried are they at the White House about the impact of Brexit on Britain, on Europe, and on the U.S. economy?
I think in descending order, they are less worried about the impact on the U.S. economy, quite worried about the impact on the European economy, but broadly worried about this idea that what we saw happen in Britain could take hold not just here, but also throughout Europe and really change the economic climate, the push toward broad trade agreements. The U.S. and Europe have been in negotiations over a trade agreement for some time now. I think that is the overarching concern, that you could see a move away from the global economic order as we know it.
But wouldn't that have an impact on our economy?
Certainly it would if we got to that point, but it's unclear whether what we saw in Britain is going to be an isolated event or whether you are going to see other countries in Europe move to leave the EU as well.
Now, George, you have a column today in which you're almost as happy about Britain leaving the EU as Nigel Farage was. Why?
Well, even the supporters of remaining in the EU approached it with a kind of weary, gloomy resignation, saying we really have no choice. And voters hate being told they have no choice. They said we're so entangled with the EU, and there'll be such calamities if we leave, that we just have to grin and bear it and hope that the EU gets better over time. For all the attempts to say that everyone in favor of leaving the EU did it for racist reasons, which is a standard progressive response, the fact is 60 to 70% of all that the British government does is either compelled or mandated or in some way controlled by Brussels and courts on the continent. Ask yourself, how many Americans would put up with 60 to 70% of America's public decisions being made by a commission in Canada and a court located in Honduras? I don't think very many. The New York Times headline yesterday said, Britain enters uncharted territory. For what, 17 centuries they were they were an independent nation. They spent 23 years in the EU, think better of it, and decide to leave, and this is considered a calamity. One other point. They remain in the really important European institution, NATO. When the Balkans were engulfed in violence and genocide, really, the EU was utterly hopeless, utterly irrelevant. NATO came to the rescue, and Britain remains a part of NATO.
In the wake of Brexit, one of the questions is how many parallels there are between what drove that decision and the presidential campaign in this country. Donald Trump, on his trip to Scotland, said there are plenty.
People want to take their country back. They want to have independence in a sense, and you see it with Europe, all over Europe. I think you're going to have this happen more and more. I really believe that, and I think it's happening in the United States.
Brit, sometimes we do see global trends. I remember in the 70s, the victory of Margaret Thatcher, which seemed to somehow lead the way or pave the way for Ronald Reagan's victory in 1980, and a kind of worldwide conservative trend around the globe. How much should we read into Brexit and Trump?
Well, it springs from some of the same sources, sense of the rise of populism, the rise of disappointment with and anger at the established order, and I think that is true in Britain and much of Europe, and it's true here. However, Margaret Thatcher, years ago, after she was out of office, said about the idea of a United States of Europe that there were very great differences, that America was the product of an idea, the idea of liberty, and Europe was the product, rather, of centuries of history, bloody history, that they were disparate cultures, and any attempt to knit them together into something like a United States would never work. It appears now that she was correct. It looks as if more of this may happen. I mention that simply to emphasize that though there are certain similarities in the political atmosphere, that the countries are very different, and as George pointed out earlier, no outside influence exercises the kind of control over life in the United States that Brussels exerts over Britain and the rest of the member countries of the EU. There's simply no parallel to it. Now, people may say that about the federal government, but that's a different matter altogether.
But trying to draw the parallels, the vote in Britain to leave the EU, it was a populist movement. It was anti-immigration, fear of trade, fear of globalization, and the fact that that leaves millions of people behind. That sounds a lot like Donald Trump's platform, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does sound like his platform, but you have to remember this was a referendum that was very specific on very specific issues versus a presidential election, which is looking at two different people and a lot of different issues. So, you're looking at Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump first, and then you're looking at what the top issues are. And for most people, that's the economy, jobs, and terrorism. Are people does immigration, is that something that gets people upset? Absolutely. Is it something they're definitely going to be voting on and choosing their candidate? Less clear. The people who are upset about immigration are already voting for Donald Trump. So in terms of how does this impact people who are kind of in the middle, I don't think it's a perfect parallel. I think that this was a very narrow issue in terms of borders and trade and immigration. It wasn't looking at choosing a leader that have two different personalities and two different leadership styles.
But Julie, I mean, the one point, and I thought Newt Gingrich made it pretty well, is it's a question of change versus the status quo. When he talked about the new mayor of Rome, I mean, that there's a sense that things aren't working and that we need to shake things up, and maybe we need to shake them up a lot, and that fear of change isn't as frightening, as off-putting as it generally is.
I had a Democrat tell me on Friday, a Democrat who's supportive of Hillary Clinton, say that Hillary Clinton can't win an election if it becomes a change election. She can win an election if it's a referendum on Donald Trump. And I think that what we learned from the Brexit vote is that we often assume that voters when they have these moments where they could choose big change, at the last moment decide to stand back and take the safer, the more conventional option. And in this case, they didn't. They chose to jump into the abyss, go with the perhaps riskier option, the less known option. And I think that is the bigger concern for Clinton than any one issue on immigration or any policy position that Trump is taking.
All right, panel, we have to take a break here.